On a cold evening on November 15, 2024, in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Cleveland, two police officers, Johnson and Davis, were on patrol during their shift. The misty air of the evening and the dim glow of streetlights reflected off the sidewalk, and everything was still, until a call from the dispatcher broke the silence. Report of a car driving on the sidewalk. Neither officer knew that this call would lead to an unforgettable encounter with a 25-year-old woman who would turn everything upside down with one reckless act of driving on the sidewalk. Under the peaceful atmosphere of a fall evening, with the streetlights flickering like tiny stars, Officers Johnson and Davis were cruising through the quiet neighborhood. The deserted streets, devoid of any pedestrians, echoed with the sound of the car's engine cutting through the still air. Both officers felt at ease, as if everything would continue smoothly as it always did. The houses on either side of the street, with warm light spilling out from their windows, created an almost picturesque scene. This was a neighborhood they knew well, one where patrols rarely brought anything out of the ordinary. However, the peaceful evening was suddenly shattered by a call over the radio, ringing through the police car. The dispatcher's urgent voice sliced through the silence, report of a car driving on the sidewalk. The announcement not only disrupted the calm, but also instantly shifted the officer's mood. The quiet moments of the evening quickly turned into a situation that required quick action. Which car is on the sidewalk? Officer Davis furrowed his brow, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the streets. This wasn't the sort of thing they typically encountered in this neighborhood. Drivers here usually followed the rules, especially considering how quiet and safe the area was. But now, they were faced with something far from normal and unpredictable situation that could lead to surprises. With a light press on the gas, they sped toward the reported area, the tension mounting in the air. Both officers knew that while the neighborhood seemed peaceful, there were always those moments in the unexpected occurred situations that no one could predict. Well, this is going to be interesting, Officer Johnson muttered under his breath, the corner of his lips curling into a faint smirk. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he smoothly swerved the patrol car toward the curb, the faint hum of the engine being the only sound cutting through the still November night. The street was quiet, illuminated only by the flickering glow of the lampposts, and the crisp air seemed to freeze the moment in time. His partner, Officer Davis, glanced at him with a raised eyebrow, sensing the tension building before them. Calls like this weren't common, and in their line of work, rare calls like these often led to unpredictable situations. As the officers drew closer, the faint outline of the vehicle appeared, parked arrogantly on the sidewalk, its headlights still blinking on and off as if the car itself was trying to escape detection. The vehicle sat there, stubborn and out of place, mocking the very laws it was supposed to follow. "Well, there she is," Officer Davis said, his voice flat, as if bracing himself for yet another round of inconvenience. Definitely not your average traffic stop. The car was positioned right on the edge of the curb, its tires half on the sidewalk and half on the road. Its presence screamed rebellion against any form of traffic etiquette. The officers pulled up beside the vehicle, expecting yet another routine encounter with an unprepared driver or someone trying to avoid a ticket. Little did they know, this encounter would be anything but typical. Inside the car, the woman behind the wheel sat frozen, her knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her eyes were locked straight ahead, unblinking, as though she were trying to will herself into invisibility. She didn't move, didn't flinch, as the patrol car came to a halt beside her. It was as if she knew something the officers didn't, or perhaps she was simply too terrified to make the first move. The world outside, with the distant hum of traffic and occasional rustling of leaves, seemed to stand still in contrast to the tension that simmered inside the vehicle. "Hello," Officer Johnson's voice broke the silence, followed by a soft knock on the window. His tone was calm, yet there was a hint of curiosity, as though trying to gauge the woman's next move. He had seen his share of strange situations, but this one felt different. There was something in the air that made his instincts twitch, though he couldn't quite place it yet. Davis, leaning against the car with his arms crossed, kept his eyes fixed on the woman, silently waiting for her response. The woman didn't react at first, her gaze still fixed ahead. A long, uncomfortable silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, she turned her head slightly toward the officers, her movement stiff and deliberate. There was something almost surreal about the way she seemed to shrink into the car, her body a strange contrast to the confidence her posture suggested. Was she hiding something? Was she simply nervous? Or was she preparing for a confrontation? Johnson's eyes narrowed, sensing that this was not going to be a simple conversation. She slowly rolled down her window, her eyes wide like saucers, her gaze filled with confusion and panic. She stared at the officer, seemingly unaware of what was happening. "What's going on? I'm just ... talking to my husband," she stammered, her voice trembling, as if she were trying to make up an excuse she didn't even believe. The fragmented words and the unnatural tone of her voice immediately signaled to the officer that she was very nervous, as though she had stepped into a situation she wasn't prepared for. Then, abruptly, she stopped and looked more flustered and panicked. "Wait, I need to call my lawyer." "No, not that. My brother, he's a lawyer." "Christian? Yeah, he's a lawyer, I swear. Can I call him now?" She repeated the excuse as a way to stall, desperately trying to find a way out of the tough situation she had found herself in. Her words grew more incoherent and tangled, as though she were grasping for something familiar, a tactic she thought might help her escape the officer's control. But the lack of conviction in her voice only made things more complicated. She was trapped in the contradiction between her panic and her attempt to remain composed, but everything was falling apart under the pressure of a situation she couldn't control. This dialogue not only showcases the character's flustered state, but also highlights the contrast between her desire to escape the situation and the reality she's facing. She tries to maintain her personal freedom by relying on her lawyer, but ultimately, it is her confusion and ignorance of the situation that only digs her deeper into this chaotic mess. Johnson glanced over at Davis. As if no words were needed between them, both understood that this would not be an ordinary interaction. For them, this wasn't just another routine patrol evening. While they often faced a variety of situations, there was something undeniably different about this one. The woman in the car, her words filled with confusion and anxiety, seemed completely unaware that she was breaking the law. Not only was she refusing to cooperate, but she was also stalling in every way possible. She glanced at them, clearly bewildered, but then boldly picked up her phone and started dialing, as if trying to create a legal shield to protect herself. "Well, ma'am, we've received a report that someone's driving on the sidewalk. And here you are, on the sidewalk. Could you please step out of the car?" Johnson spoke up, trying to keep his tone calm but clearly showing signs of impatience as it wore thin. He tried to maintain composure while ensuring the situation stay under control. This was his job, and he had to make sure everything followed protocol. The woman, seemingly unaware of the seriousness of the situation, mumbled, "I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do here," before turning back to dial a number for someone named Christian. As she spoke, she appeared to be convincing herself she was in control of the situation. "I'll talk to Christian first. You guys never understand me. I don't trust you," she continued, her words dripping with frustration and mistrust, as though the police were her enemies. She hoped this call would somehow get her out of the mess, or at least buy her more time to figure out how to escape. The scene was striking. Here was a woman, clearly facing a straightforward traffic violation. Yet instead of taking responsibility and cooperating, she chose to resist and evade. Her reactions demonstrated anxiety, a lack of understanding of the actual situation, and, most notably, an excessive distrust of those who were simply trying to help. While this wasn't the first time officers had dealt with such behavior, it certainly added a layer of tension to the moment, making it more difficult to resolve. "Ma'am, it's pretty simple," Officer Davis tried, his voice calm but firm, hoping to de-escalate the situation. He knew the importance of staying level-headed, but the longer this standoff went on, the harder it became to remain patient. "You're parked on the sidewalk, we're investigating, and we need you to step out." Davis, a seasoned officer, continued to explain in clear, simple terms, hoping that his straightforward approach would help her realize that cooperation would make everything easier. But instead of acknowledging the situation calmly, the woman was lost in confusion, anxiety, and appeared to find comfort only in her phone call. She kept repeating incoherent phrases, almost as though trying to convince herself that she wasn't at fault. "I'm not talking to the cops anymore. They always mess things up," she said, her voice filled with anger and disappointment, as if every interaction with the police ended in misunderstanding and injustice. Her words carried a sense of frustration and a feeling of being oppressed, reflecting a history of negative encounters with authorities that she felt had been unfair. She continued, "I need to talk to my lawyer, or Christian. He's my lawyer. Okay." This wasn't just a simple request, it was a form of evasion. She was searching for a lifeline in her helplessness. Calling Christian, who she claimed was her lawyer, seemed to be her way of pushing the situation away and avoiding the guilt or fear of what was happening. Grasping the phone, engrossed in the call to someone who she hoped would solve everything, only intensified her confusion and helplessness in dealing with the law. In this moment, there was not just evasion, but strong resistance against the police. The woman seemed unable to escape her frustration and discomfort with the authorities, and this made her feel cornered, with no other escape but to call someone who could offer her a sense of safety and protection. This created a tense atmosphere, with one side trying to remain calm and manage the situation, while the other side attempted to avoid and seek comfort from external factors. Both sides carried their own anxieties. The officers worried about maintaining order and enforcing the law, while the woman feared the consequences of her actions, feeling misunderstood and isolated in her interactions with law enforcement. As time ticked on, the tension in the air grew thicker as the woman continued to stall, as though each passing moment was a desperate attempt to ease her fear and unease. "Look, I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to go home. I'll call my lawyer. I'll call Christian. Okay." She repeated these lines like a broken record, hoping that anyone would help her find a way out of this deadlock. She kept trying to buy herself a little more time to calm her nerves, but the officer's patience was running out. Officer Davis sighed, exhaustion clearly visible on his face as he rubbed his temple. "Ma'am, you need to get out of the car right now," he said, his voice no longer patient. He knew the situation had dragged on for too long and that his leniency was only making her more defiant. She, still unwilling to relent, exaggerated her frustration with a dramatic gesture. "Wait, I'm calling Christian. I'm going to get arrested. I can feel it. This is a joke. You can't do this to me. I'm not talking to you," she yelled, her voice suddenly shrill, as if trying to use her words to fight off the mounting pressure. Her outrage was like a cage around her reasoning, clouding her ability to make a clear decision. She wasn't just refusing to cooperate. She was trying to avoid responsibility, hoping that by repeating her pleas, the police would ease up and give her one last chance. But in the meantime, the atmosphere between the two parties became even more charged, like a long, exhausting game where neither side was willing to concede. "Well, right now, you are being detained," Officer Johnson said with a calm yet firm tone, his voice steady despite the escalating tension. His hand gestured to Officer Davis, signaling him to move closer as they prepared to take the next step. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car." The woman's expression twisted in utter disbelief, her face a mixture of confusion and indignation. "What do you mean? I did nothing wrong," she exclaimed, her voice rising in a panicked shriek. The words seemed to pour out before she could fully process them, as if she believed that denying the situation would somehow make it vanish. But despite her frantic protests, the officers exchanged a glance of mutual understanding, knowing they had to take control of the situation. Slowly but deliberately, they opened the car door, and with a gentle but insistent nudge, they guided her out of the vehicle. The woman resisted, her body tense and her movements jerky, but the officer's patience had clearly begun to wear thin. Standing now outside the car, the woman looked as though she were still trying to grasp what was happening. Her hands were trembling as she glanced from one officer to the other, trying to piece together the reality of the moment. "I haven't had a drink," she insisted, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke. But the words were starting to lose their conviction, as if even she wasn't sure she believed them anymore. Her speech, which had started off clear and defiant, was beginning to slur, the telltale sign of intoxication she could no longer deny. "I don't even know why I'm here. This is insane," she added, her hands waving in the air as if the very act of gesturing would somehow erase her predicament. As Officer Davis calmly began to search the vehicle, the truth was quickly revealed. He slid his hand beneath the seat and pulled out a partially hidden bottle of liquor. Another bottle, this one more conspicuously placed, rolled across the floor of the car like an unwelcome guest at a party. "Ma'am," Davis said with a tone of finality, holding up one of the bottles, "this is evidence." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before continuing. Looks like you've had a little more than a sip." His words were measured, but there was no denying the gravity of the situation now. The woman's previous denials, her feeble attempts to absolve herself, were now met with the hard reality of the evidence in plain sight. The realization hit her like a cold wave, her face draining of color as the weight of her own actions became undeniable. The bottles of alcohol were not just forgotten items in her car. They were pieces of a puzzle that painted a clear picture of intoxication and reckless driving. And in that moment, the woman knew that her deflections and excuses had finally run their course. Evidence? No. No, you've got it all wrong. She screamed, her arms flailing as if she could push the truth away with her own movements. These words weren't simply a denial, they were a desperate attempt to escape facing the reality of the undeniable. Her eyes locked onto the officers, full of confusion and anger, as if they were unforgiving enemies. "I'll call Christian, I'll call my lawyer. I don't trust you guys," she repeated herself, growing louder each time, as though calling someone would make the situation vanish. Her defiance was clear and unyielding. The police were ready to read her rights, but it seemed like the legal explanations were falling on deaf ears. Instead, she continued to complain about past mistreatment by the police, bitterness and hurt bubbling to the surface. "You always make everything worse. I've been choked. I've been. Oh wait, not like that. I was. Ooh, I hate cops." Her voice was losing control, words tumbling out awkwardly before she quickly corrected herself. Each word she spoke seemed like an unconscious reaction, a way to justify herself and shift blame for her own failures. She wasn't just resisting arrest, she was laying bare the wounds of past encounters with law enforcement, complicating matters even further. The tension and helplessness hung thick in the air as she grew more tangled in her emotions, unable to control her outbursts. The officers, though used to situations like this, still felt the strain in the atmosphere, but they couldn't allow her personal emotions to interfere with their duties. Each word she uttered seemed like a fragmented piece of an unfinished story, reflecting an inner conflict between holding her ground and a deep-seated insecurity. "Ma'am," Johnson said, trying to remain calm, "I'm going to read you your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Johnson's voice was soft but firm, as though trying to make it clear that no matter how tense the situation, the law still had to be followed. At this moment, he wasn't waiting for an answer, but instead working through the frustration of having to deal with someone who just wouldn't cooperate. His words weren't just reminders, they were an intervention in her unrestrained fury. He had a job to do, and he needed to read her rights, for her protection as much as for his own. "No. I want to talk to my lawyer," she screamed, her voice rising, panic and hysteria creeping in. Her entire body was stiff, as if she couldn't bear the weight of the stress pressing down on her shoulders. "This isn't fair. You never listened to me. All I wanted was to go home, and now you've ruined my life. You're going to pay for this, I swear." By now, she had lost all composure and reason. The sense of injustice surged like a tidal wave, sweeping away any rational thought, leaving only pure anger. "You're going to pay for this" became a curse, born from the conflict between fear and rage. She felt wronged, and in her mind, this was the only way to respond to what felt like oppression. Yet, amid the chaos, she failed to realize that it was her own actions that had led her to this point. Davis sighed. Clearly fed up, he shook his head gently as if he had heard enough. "You're drunk and under arrest. We're taking you to jail now. Let's go." Davis wasn't about to entertain excuses or justifications. He wanted to resolve the situation quickly and efficiently. His tone was calm but carried an undeniable firmness. His words weren't an invitation for debate, but a clear directive. While Johnson still tried to maintain some semblance of diplomacy, Davis didn't hesitate to make a decision. He had seen enough. There was no room for hesitation. The decision was made. Take the woman where she needed to go, regardless of her protests. This situation, though an attempt to maintain order, was riddled with internal contradictions. The woman felt persecuted, while the officers were simply doing their jobs, enforcing the law. To them, they were the embodiment of justice, but to her, they were the obstacles in her life. Her gaze was that of someone backed into a corner, and theirs were the eyes of people who couldn't back down. This clash, between someone striving to preserve their sense of fairness and another attempting to evade punishment, revealed the complexities of the relationship between individuals and the law. In the end, despite her efforts, the woman could not escape the consequences of her reckless actions and stubbornness. As the police car carried her to the station, her protests faded into the background hum of the engine, and the evidence she left behind became even clearer. This story wasn't just about an arrest, it was a lesson in facing responsibility and the consequences of one's actions. No one can escape accountability when they make mistakes, no matter how defiant they may be. The lesson here is, excessive confidence and a refusal to cooperate can only make things worse. Sometimes, acknowledging mistakes, listening, and working with law enforcement can save time and prevent harsher consequences. Moreover, in any situation, maintaining composure and accountability for one's actions is crucial. Mistakes, whether intentional or accidental, can lead to unpredictable results.